My name is Rachel Lawson. I'm 33 years old, and this is my story. It happened during a holiday that was supposed to be about gratitude, about family, about unity. But for me, that Thanksgiving turned out to be a mirror that revealed the ugliest truths I'd been trying not to see. You see, sometimes the people you bend over backwards for are the same ones who pretend you're invisible until you make it impossible for them to ignore you. That year, I decided to host Thanksgiving dinner. Not just host it, but pay for everything. Every dish, every decoration, every drop of wine. I'd just landed a promotion at the marketing agency where I worked, and while my salary was decent, my heart was even bigger. I wanted to give back. I wanted to make my family feel special. After all, wasn't that what family was about? It had been years since we'd all come together. My parents were divorced. My brother lived in Bend with his wife and kids, and my cousins were scattered across the state. But this year, they all agreed. Salem it would be. My home, my table, my money. I started planning weeks in advance. I hired a local catering company to help with the cooking. I spent hours researching centerpieces that matched autumn palettes: deep burgundy, golden orange, and soft earthy browns. I had place cards with each person's name written in calligraphy. I ordered extra folding chairs, brought in a heater for the patio, and even made goodie bags for the kids. But none of that mattered. Before I continue this story, leave a comment with your name and where you're watching from. I want to know who's here with me, those of you brave enough to hear the raw truth, because what I'm about to share next, it's not easy to talk about, but I know I'm not alone. Maybe you've felt the same sting of being overlooked by your own family, or the ache of always giving and never being seen. If so, I hope my voice gives you strength. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss how this story unfolds. It might just change the way you see yourself. From the moment my family stepped into my home, I felt like a stranger at my own celebration. No one complimented the decor. No one asked how I'd been. They talked to each other like I wasn't there. My brother, Nathan, walked in carrying his famous pecan pie and handed it to me with a casual, "Here, this will help," as if my efforts were lacking. Aunt Susan made a comment about how I'd finally gotten it together, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And my mother, who had only recently started speaking to me again after a long silence following her third divorce, kept talking over me every time I tried to lead a toast or introduce a dish. I told myself it was just nerves. Family dynamics could be messy, especially after so much time apart. But that optimism crumbled as the evening went on. Dinner was served buffet style. I'd arranged the dishes on the kitchen island: a beautiful roast turkey with rosemary and garlic, a smoked ham glazed with maple syrup, mashed potatoes whipped with cream, stuffing with cranberries and walnuts, and 2 types of gravy. Because my dad liked his thin and my stepmom liked hers thick. I had everything timed perfectly, but when it came time to eat, I noticed something that made my heart sink. They served themselves, and me last. I stood there, awkwardly waiting, smiling weakly, holding an empty plate as each relative piled their dishes high. I wasn't just served last, I was overlooked. My plate stayed empty while the children grabbed seconds, while my mother took all the turkey skin, while my brother's wife used the last ladle of thick gravy. No one asked if I'd eaten. No one saved me a slice of pie. I watched it all in slow motion, that subtle cruelty masquerading as carelessness. I excused myself and went into the guest bathroom. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just stared at myself in the mirror, my makeup still intact, my expression flat. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they didn't notice. Maybe it wasn't on purpose. But deep down, I knew better. This had been happening for years. Ever since I chose not to follow the family mold. Marriage by 25, kids by 30, a predictable suburban life. I chose work, ambition, freedom. I wasn't the one they bragged about during phone calls. I was the odd one out. Still, I came back. I opened my home, my wallet, my heart, and they served me last. When I returned to the living room, I found myself standing in the corner while everyone laughed about stories I wasn't a part of. The TV played in the background, football, of course, and the kids were throwing crumbs on the floor I had scrubbed that morning. My dad had spilled red wine on the new rug and didn't even apologize. He just looked at me, chuckled, and said, "Next time, don't go for white." Next time? There wouldn't be a next time. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I waited. I let the night play out. I let them bask in their obliviousness, in their illusion that this gathering was theirs, that they were entitled to it all without question. Around 9:30, people started leaving. One by one, they gave half-hearted hugs, offered obligatory thanks, and walked out the door with leftovers in their arms and wine on their breath. No one offered to help clean. No one even noticed that I hadn't eaten. And then it was just my mother, still nursing a glass of Chardonnay, sitting by the fireplace scrolling through her phone. That's when I said it. "By the way, I paid for everything tonight." She looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean the food, the drinks, the cutlery, the chairs, the decorations, the gifts, all of it. Every dollar came out of my pocket." There was a pause, a long one. "I thought everyone chipped in," she said quietly. "No one chipped in, Mom. No one even asked. Not once." She blinked at me, as if trying to recalibrate her understanding of the evening. "But I was just getting started. I gave you all a place to be together. I welcomed you into my home. And still, I was served last, like an afterthought." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I didn't wait for her to respond. I'm done being the one who holds everyone together just to be treated like I don't belong. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed the untouched pie I had made, apple crumble, my favorite, and cut a generous slice. I sat at the table, finally, and took my first bite of the night. My mother left quietly after that. No goodbye, no apology, and for the first time in my life, I didn't chase after closure. I had made my point. Without yelling, without tears, just truth, served straight. That night, I ate alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was awake. And the next Thanksgiving? Let's just say, it wasn't in Salem, and no one got an invitation. The days following Thanksgiving felt oddly calm. It was like something inside me had finally clicked into place. I wasn't sad, and I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. Clear about where I stood in my family. Clear about the role I'd played for far too long. I had spent years being the peacekeeper, the provider, the one who never asked for much but gave everything. And now, with one quiet truth, I had pulled the rug out from under them. I didn't hear from anyone for days. No texts, no follow-ups, not even a passive-aggressive comment on social media. It was silence, and I let it breathe. I didn't chase it, didn't poke the hornet's nest, didn't try to soften the blow. For once, I let the discomfort stay exactly where it belonged, with them. But silence never lasts long in a family like mine. The first ripple came from my cousin Laura, the one who had brought her new boyfriend and spent most of the dinner talking about her recent vacation to Cancun. She sent a casual message. "Hey, didn't get a chance to thank you for hosting. Everything was great." It was 2 lines. Polite, insincere, and it reeked of damage control. I didn't reply. Then came my brother, Nathan. He called me one evening while I was at home drinking tea and watching an old movie. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message, the usual nonchalant tone masking something heavier. "Hey, Rach. Just wanted to say thanks for putting everything together. I think maybe there were some misunderstandings. But, yeah, let's talk sometime." Misunderstandings. That word rolled around in my mind like a pebble in a shoe, as if what happened was some miscommunication, like I'd been too sensitive or misread the situation, as if being treated like a stranger in my own house was somehow negotiable. I didn't return the call either. But what I didn't expect was what happened next. My mother showed up at my house on a Thursday afternoon, completely unannounced. I was working from home, in the middle of reviewing a branding campaign for a new tech client, when I heard the knock. I opened the door, and there she was, standing in her beige coat, clutching a paper bag filled with something that smelled like banana bread. She looked smaller than usual, like her confidence had shrunk since Thanksgiving. Her eyes searched mine, looking for an entry point, some sign that I was still her daughter and not the woman who had ruined the evening with one uncomfortable truth. "I thought maybe we could talk," she said. I hesitated but stepped aside. She walked in slowly, as if the house might collapse under her feet. I gestured toward the couch and sat across from her, not next to her. She placed the bag on the coffee table. "I baked. Your favorite. I didn't ask for anything, I said. She nodded, hands folded in her lap. I know. I just thought, maybe it's time I said some things. I didn't speak. I just let her sit in the tension she had helped create. I didn't realize, she started. I didn't know you felt so left out. I tilted my head. Didn't realize or didn't care. She winced. Rachel, no, really. I need to know. Because I've spent my entire adult life showing up for people who don't even look up when I walk into the room. I cooked, I cleaned, I planned, I paid, and you let me stand at the back of the line like I was the help. She looked down at her hands. You've always been strong, independent. I guess I thought you didn't need kindness? I finished. Respect? Inclusion? Her silence was answer enough. I didn't say anything for years because I kept hoping it would change. That if I worked hard enough or proved myself enough, eventually you'd see me the way I wanted to be seen. Her voice trembled. I do see you. No, you don't. You see the version of me that's useful, the one that pays for dinner, organizes holidays, fills in the gaps. But the second I have a need, silence. She blinked quickly, like she was trying to keep tears at bay. I'm sorry. I believed her, but an apology doesn't fix a pattern. It doesn't erase years of being the invisible backbone of a family that never thanked you. I'm not angry, I said, but I'm not going back either. Not to how things were. What does that mean? It means I'm done chasing crumbs of affection. I'm done showing up for people who only remember me when they need something. You want a relationship with me? Great, but it has to be on new terms. She nodded, eyes glossy. Okay. After she left, I didn't feel better, but I did feel firm, like a foundation had been laid beneath me. One I built myself. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic with my family began to shift. Slowly. Nathan sent me a real message, asking if we could meet for lunch. He showed up awkward and uncertain, but he didn't deflect. He admitted they'd taken me for granted, that seeing me speak up had made him uncomfortable, but also made him reflect. I think I forgot you're human, he said with a bitter laugh. You've always just handled everything. And that was the truth. I had handled it. All of it. Until I didn't. Thanksgiving had been a performance, but not mine. It had been theirs. A performance of unity, of family, of connection. One that shattered the moment the spotlight turned on them. I started therapy soon after. Not because I was broken, but because I wanted to stay whole. I needed a place where I could speak freely, without having to explain why being served last wasn't just about food. It was about years of emotional starvation. I focused on myself. I traveled to the Oregon coast one weekend, stayed in a cozy cabin overlooking Cannon Beach. I hiked alone, watched the waves crash, and felt something inside me soften. I read books that fed my soul. I turned down invitations that didn't feel like genuine gestures. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. But even as I healed, part of me still wanted to make them understand. Not gently, not with restraint. I wanted them to feel what I had felt. Marginalized, unseen, dismissed. I wanted them to sit in a room they didn't belong in and question their worth. That desire didn't consume me, but it did sit quietly in the background, waiting for a moment. And then, Christmas came. The group chat came alive again, and just like that, the old patterns began to emerge. Aunt Susan asked who was hosting. Cousin Laura said she could bring wine but couldn't take on too much. Nathan offered to deep fry a turkey. No one mentioned the cost. No one offered a plan. And then my mother messaged, "Rachel, are you hosting again?" 6 words. That's all it took to wake the fire back up. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, not with sadness this time, but with clarity. I typed my response slowly, deliberately. No, I've decided to take a break from hosting family events. I hope you all have a wonderful time. Please make sure everyone eats in the order they deserve. I didn't wait for the replies. I turned off notifications and went outside to feel the December air sting my cheeks. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line. And the best part? I didn't feel guilty. They had served me last. But I had the final word. Christmas passed without much fanfare. I spent it alone by choice, in a quiet Airbnb nestled in the hills just outside Ashland, Oregon. I decorated a small pine tree with silver and blue ornaments I picked up from a local shop and cooked myself a simple dinner. Stuffed portobellos, roasted potatoes, and a cranberry spritzer with fresh rosemary. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. I lit candles, played soft jazz, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in. I was exactly where I belonged, with myself, in the silence of those quiet mountain nights. Something unexpected began to surface. Not sadness, not even anger, but a realization. The truth wasn't that I had been excluded. The truth was I had spent too long letting them define what inclusion even meant. I had molded myself into what they needed: reliable, self-sufficient, emotionally muted, and in doing so, I had slowly disappeared from my own story. But now, I was reclaiming it, chapter by chapter. It was during this time that I received an email from my cousin Laura. A real email, not a group chat, not a text. The subject line read, "About Thanksgiving. I owe you an explanation." I opened it with low expectations, assuming it would be another half apology. But as I read, something shifted. She wrote about how she had felt invisible her entire life, overshadowed by her siblings, dismissed by their parents. And when I hosted Thanksgiving, she said, she was too wrapped up in proving her own worth to even acknowledge mine. She said seeing me stand up for myself rattled something inside her. It made her realize that she wasn't the only one pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She ended the message with a simple line, "You didn't just speak for yourself that night. You spoke for me too." I sat with that for a while. Maybe the truth had rippled farther than I thought. I returned to Salem after the new year. Winter in Oregon was always a mix of cold rain and gray skies, but I felt strangely energized. I'd started volunteering at a local women's resource center downtown, mostly helping with resume workshops and mentoring younger women trying to get back on their feet. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt real, meaningful, unlike the performative charity that often showed up around the holidays. This was connection without expectation. I began building a version of family that wasn't blood, but choice. But as the weeks passed, something started to shift in the group chat. One by one, my family members started posting about upcoming birthdays and Easter plans. They posted photos of themselves having brunch together in Bend or catching a movie in Portland. I hadn't been invited. At first it stung. There was still a reflex inside me that wanted to be included, even if I didn't want to go. But the more I looked at the pictures, the more I noticed something strange. They weren't smiling. Their bodies were there, but their eyes were vacant, forced, like they were keeping up appearances more than creating memories. And in a small, quiet way, I felt vindicated. Because I hadn't just walked away from dysfunction, I'd taken away their favorite mirror, me, the one who held it all together while they basked in their delusion of unity. Still, part of me knew this wasn't finished. Something deeper was at play. A reckoning was coming, and I felt it the way you feel the pressure shift before a storm. In mid-March, I received a formal letter in the mail. At first, I thought it was a late Christmas card, or maybe an invitation. But when I opened the cream envelope, I found a printed notice from my father's lawyer. It said he was planning to sell the family cabin, the one in Sisters where we used to go every summer when we were kids. It was the only place I had real memories of joy with my family. It had been in our name for 3 generations. And apparently he had decided to list it without even informing me. Just a courtesy note, not an invitation to weigh in. That was the moment it snapped. I wasn't just being excluded anymore. I was being erased. Bit by bit. Decision by decision. They weren't just moving on without me. They were pretending I had never been part of it at all. I called the lawyer directly. He was polite, but distant. He confirmed that my father had full ownership rights after the divorce and could make the sale unilaterally. "It's a private sale," he said. "He's already in talks with a couple from Seattle." I hung up the phone and stared out my window for a long time. Rain fell in steady sheets against the glass, and everything outside looked as blurry as I felt inside. But beneath that fog, a fire began to burn. They had removed me from the table. Now I would remove the table. I contacted a real estate consultant I'd worked with during my promotion at the agency, one who specialized in high-profile property acquisitions. We spoke for hours. I asked her to find out everything she could about the prospective buyers, the status of the deal, and whether there was a legal opening for an alternative offer. It turned out the couple from Seattle hadn't signed anything yet. They were still touring other properties. The deal wasn't sealed. I had options. But I didn't just want to buy the cabin. That would be too easy. I wanted them to know that I bought it. And not to preserve some fake nostalgia, but to reclaim what they thought they could take from me. I worked with my consultant for weeks. I offered above asking price. I included a clause that guaranteed immediate ownership transfer. I handled every detail myself. Within a month, the deal was finalized. The title was mine. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I waited until Easter Sunday. That's when they posted a picture. My father, my brother, their spouses, Aunt Susan, the usual crew, posing on the porch of the cabin, smiling, arms linked, wine glasses raised. The caption read, "One last Easter at the family cabin before it sells." So many memories here. And underneath, in the comments, I left one sentence. Actually, it's not being sold anymore. There was confusion at first, then private messages, then phone calls. I didn't answer any of them. Finally, my brother texted, "Wait, did you buy the cabin?" I replied with a single word, "Yes." The storm I'd felt coming finally arrived, not in screams or accusations, but in silence, in the form of sudden absence. I wasn't blocked, but I was frozen out. No replies, no more messages, just a collective gasp that never turned into words. But this time, I didn't flinch. I sat at that cabin weeks later, curled up on the same porch swing from my childhood, a mug of coffee in my hands. The air smelled of pine and rain, and I wasn't alone. I had invited a few women from the resource center, women who had become family in a way blood never managed to be. We laughed, we ate, we shared stories by the fireplace. They listened. They saw me. And I realized that I hadn't just taken back a piece of property. I had taken back my narrative. That was the turning point. Not the Thanksgiving where I was served last, but the spring when I finally served myself. Owning the cabin changed something fundamental in me. It wasn't just about having the keys to a property that held a lifetime of memories. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had once sacrificed for acceptance. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself over the illusion of family. And that choice, though it came with its own kind of ache, gave me a clarity I'd never known before. I spent the spring fixing the place up, not because it needed a renovation. It was still structurally solid, but because it deserved to feel alive again. I stripped the faded wallpaper in the bedrooms and painted the walls warm, earthy tones. I replaced the old curtains with linen drapes that let in more light, sanded down the wooden floors until they glowed. Each task was meditative, each coat of paint a layer peeled off my past. It felt like I was washing away the shadows of old conversations, of silent dinners and veiled judgment, of the younger version of me who always tried too hard to be enough. I didn't rush through it. I took my time, working on weekends and during days off. I played music as I worked. Everything from folk to old soul records, and sometimes I'd just sit on the porch for hours, wrapped in a blanket, letting the wind move through the trees like whispered affirmations. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I started writing again too, something I'd stopped doing years ago. Nothing formal, just personal reflections, journal entries, poems that didn't rhyme but told the truth. And in those pages, I started to see who I was becoming. Not a version of myself that fit anyone's expectations, but the woman who had survived disappointment and kept standing anyway. My friendships deepened during this time. The women from the resource center became my chosen family. There was Monica, who had just left a 10-year abusive marriage and was learning how to smile again, and Patrice, a single mom rebuilding her life after being cut off from her parents for choosing wrong. We had dinners at the cabin, not just on holidays but on ordinary Sundays. We made meals together, tacos, soups, fresh bread. We laughed loud, didn't rush conversations, didn't perform for each other. The air felt easier around them. They knew what it meant to be overlooked, to be left out of the narrative, and still write a new chapter anyway. One night, as we sat around the fireplace, Patrice asked, What made you finally say no? I paused for a long moment before answering. They served me last, I said softly. And it wasn't about the food. It was about all the ways they had always done it. Quietly, subtly, like I didn't matter unless I was useful. Monica nodded slowly. And you didn't scream, didn't flip the table. You just left. No, I said. I stayed. I hosted. I paid. And then I told the truth. That was enough. Patrice smiled at me like I had handed her a new tool for her own toolbox. Maybe I had. Maybe that's what healing looks like. Not loud, not grand, just true. That summer, something strange began to happen. I started getting invites again. First, it was a Facebook event from my cousin Laura, inviting me to her baby shower in Portland. Then, a wedding invitation from a second cousin I barely spoke to. And then, the boldest one, an email from my father asking if I'd be interested in hosting a reunion at the cabin in the fall. He said the family missed me, that things felt fractured and they wanted to start over. It would have been easy to say no. And part of me wanted to, just for the satisfaction. But another part of me was curious. Not hopeful, just curious. Were they reaching out because they had changed? Or because they missed the version of me who made things easier? I responded with a question. Would this be a reunion or a reset? He replied the next day. A reset, if you're willing. I agreed, with conditions. Everyone would contribute financially, no exceptions. Everyone would participate in preparation and cleanup, and I would not be the emotional sponge for anyone's discomfort. If it started to feel like old times, I would walk away without apology. He accepted the terms. The planning began. I was surprised at how quickly things came together. People responded to emails, asked what they could bring, coordinated tasks. It felt mature, like maybe the discomfort had forced them to grow too. I still held my reservations, though. I wasn't doing this to mend what couldn't be mended. I was doing this to show myself that I could stand in the same room and no longer shrink. The reunion took place on a crisp September afternoon. The trees were beginning to turn gold around the edges, and the air had that first taste of autumn. I had arranged everything ahead of time. Tables on the back lawn, a fire pit, twinkling lights overhead. When the first guests arrived, I felt a twinge of nervousness, but it passed. I had nothing to prove. Nathan came up to me first. He hugged me without hesitation and said, "Thanks for giving this a shot." I nodded. "Thanks for respecting the boundaries." He didn't push further. We understood each other now in a way we never had before. The afternoon unfolded gently. People mingled, ate, helped clean, made conversation without circling around me like I was the hired help. And though there were still moments that reminded me of the past, a tone, a glance, a half-joke, I didn't take the bait. I didn't laugh to keep the peace or smile through discomfort. I let them sit in their own awkwardness if they made a mistake. That was part of their growth, not mine. My mother arrived late. She brought a dish, scalloped potatoes, her specialty, and placed it on the table without ceremony. Later, when most people had wandered off to walk by the lake or toast marshmallows, she found me sitting on the porch. "I didn't think you'd do this," she said. "I almost didn't," I replied. She looked out at the trees, then back at me. "You changed." "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending." She nodded. "Maybe I'm finally starting to see who you are." "Maybe," I said. "But I've always been here." She didn't cry. Neither did I. But something softened between us. Not healed, but less brittle. It would take time, or maybe it wouldn't happen at all. Either way, I was okay. That night, after everyone left, I walked through the cabin, checking for dishes and wiping down countertops. I moved slowly, not out of exhaustion, but reverence. I had hosted my family again, but on my terms, and they had respected it. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of growth. Either way, they had met me where I stood, and I didn't have to leave myself behind to meet them. I climbed into bed, wrapped in flannel sheets. The windows cracked just enough to let the scent of pine drift in. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep came, thinking about the little girl I used to be, the one who waited quietly for someone to notice her, to save her a seat, to remember her favorite color. I whispered to her, right before I closed my eyes, "You're not invisible anymore." The reunion had gone more smoothly than I expected. People showed up, brought food, participated, respected boundaries. On the surface, it was a success. But healing isn't linear. Growth isn't always honest. Sometimes it's performative, fragile, and waits for the first crack to show its true shape. In the weeks that followed, I noticed that although the reunion had opened a door, it hadn't necessarily led to a room of sincerity. The old dynamics were still alive, quieter now, subtler, but not gone. My father sent me a gift basket a week later. Inside were assorted cheeses, chocolates, and a card that read, "Thanks for hosting. We'll count on you next year." 6 words again, just like that text at Christmas. 6 words that told me everything. Not, "Would you like to host?" Not, "Can we talk about next time?" Just a soft assumption, wrapped in caramel ribbons and gourmet crackers. It wasn't gratitude. It was convenience dressed in politeness. That card sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I threw it away. And with it, I threw away the idea that they had truly changed. About a month later, I got a call from Aunt Susan. She wanted to discuss a little idea the family had come up with, holding Thanksgiving again at the cabin. Not just a dinner, a full weekend retreat. They'd chip in this time, she said, almost proudly, like it was a grand gesture. She talked about scheduling, meal rotations, even group activities like a wine tasting or trivia night. "You made the place so welcoming," she said. "It feels like the heart of the family again." I stared at the phone in silence. She continued, "We figured you could reserve the weekend and just let us know what we need to reimburse. It'll be so easy this time." Reimburse? As if a receipt could account for emotional labor. As if writing a check erased years of being ignored, used, forgotten. I realized then that to them, the cabin wasn't a symbol of change. It was a convenience, a pretty backdrop for their curated family image. I interrupted her. "Susan, the cabin's not a rental." She chuckled. "Of course not. I mean, it's not available. Not this Thanksgiving. Not anymore." Silence. And then, "I thought we were moving forward, Rachel." "We are," I said. "But forward doesn't mean back to the same roles." I ended the call before she could respond. After that, the ripple began again. Messages trickled in. Cousin Laura was confused. My brother called, frustrated this time. "You can't just cut us off again," he said. We were finally getting somewhere. "Were we?" I asked. "You tell me," he snapped. So I did. I told him that the reunion wasn't proof of healing. It was a test, and they had failed. Not because they made one mistake, but because they never truly asked why the old dynamics had hurt me in the first place. They hadn't sat with the discomfort of their behavior. They hadn't reckoned with the fact that I had served them with grace, generosity, and patience, only to be treated like I didn't exist. I reminded him of that Thanksgiving, of standing with an empty plate while they passed food like I was wallpaper, and how none of them saw it, because they never had to look. He tried to defend it. "We didn't mean anything by it." "That's the point," I said. "You never meant it, but you did it." The conversation ended with him saying he needed time to think. I told him to take all the time he wanted. I wasn't waiting anymore. That was when I made the final decision. I didn't just want boundaries. I wanted change. Real structural change. I met with a real estate attorney, someone sharp and precise. I told her I wanted to transfer ownership of the cabin into a private foundation, a nonprofit retreat center for women recovering from emotional trauma and family estrangement. It would be a place for healing, for storytelling, for reclamation. It wouldn't bear the Lawson name. It would be anonymous, free, safe. She helped me restructure the deed, file the paperwork, protect the assets. It took weeks, but when it was done, the property was no longer just mine. It was sacred, untouchable. Not another holiday destination, but a sanctuary. I held a small ceremony for the transition. Just me, Monica, Patrice, and a few others from the center. We lit candles, wrote down the names of people we had once needed validation from, and tossed those papers into the fireplace. We cried, we laughed, we cooked soup from scratch and danced barefoot in the living room to Stevie Nicks. That night, I felt like I had rewritten the entire meaning of Thanksgiving. It was no longer about performing gratitude for people who didn't deserve it. It was about choosing who sat at my table and why. Word eventually got out. I don't know how. Maybe someone saw a post. Maybe someone at the county clerk's office mentioned it. All I know is, one afternoon, I got a letter in the mail, handwritten, from my mother. It wasn't angry. It wasn't begging either. It was just stunned. "I don't understand why you would give it away," she wrote. "That place was ours." I stared at the word ours for a long time, and I realized she was right. It had been ours. But that was the problem. It had been shared in name only. I had built something beautiful, and they had taken from it without understanding its cost. I didn't respond to her letter, because there was nothing left to explain. They had served me last. And I had responded by reclaiming first place in my own life. One afternoon in early November, I returned to the cabin one more time. It was the last visit before the nonprofit board officially assumed operations. I walked through every room slowly, trailing my hand along the walls, whispering goodbye to ghosts I'd long outgrown. In the living room, I found a photo on the bookshelf I must have missed before. It was from when I was 7, sitting on my grandfather's lap, both of us grinning at the camera, plates of food in our hands. He had been the last person in my family who saw me without conditions, who noticed when I was quiet, who asked questions and actually listened. I kept that photo. It was the only thing I took from the house. As I stood on the porch for the final time, the air smelled of pine and wood smoke. The wind carried whispers through the trees, and in them, I heard all the versions of myself I'd buried for the sake of keeping others comfortable. They weren't bitter. They were free. This was the climax, the final turning of the page, not a moment of confrontation, but of liberation. Thanksgiving came and went that year without a single message from my family. No group chat notifications, no emails asking for recipes or confirmations of who would bring what. The silence was louder than any argument we could have had, but it didn't echo through me like it once would have. This time, it didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. There was no tension in my shoulders, no ache in my chest waiting for someone to remember me. There was only stillness, and within it, a quiet kind of joy. I spent that day exactly how I wanted, in the company of women who knew what it meant to start over. Monica brought sweet potato casserole with marshmallows melted to golden perfection. Patrice showed up with spiced apple cider and a playlist that filled the house with warmth. Other women from the center arrived too, some with their children, some with trembling hands still new to freedom, all of them carrying their own invisible stories. We ate together. We went around the room and shared what we were grateful for, not in the hollow way people do out of tradition, but with voices that cracked and eyes that filled with tears. Every word spoken that day was real, raw, redeemed. Later that evening, we lit candles and placed them on the long wooden table. I told them that this cabin, this place, was theirs now too. Not as guests, but as family. We sat in the flickering light, eating pie and telling stories. Not of trauma, but of resilience. It was the kind of Thanksgiving I had always dreamed of. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing needed to be. I stepped outside alone after the dishes were cleared. The sky above the Oregon woods was clear, stars blooming across the dark like tiny promises. I leaned against the porch railing and breathed in the cold air, letting it fill my lungs and then release, like I was exhaling every last thread that had tied me to the past. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't look back. I simply stood there, alive, whole, and finally complete. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how differently I walked through the world. There was a steadiness in me now, a rootedness that came from knowing who I was, without needing anyone else to confirm it. I no longer worried about invitations that never came, or birthdays that were forgotten. I stopped trying to make space for people who had shown me over and over again that they would never truly see me. And with that letting go came an unexpected gift. Space for the right people to step in. I met someone during a community event in downtown Salem. His name was Aaron. He ran a small nonprofit that worked with foster youth transitioning into adulthood. We ended up chatting over coffee during a volunteer planning session. His voice was gentle, his eyes kind. He didn't ask invasive questions. He just listened. The first time I told him about the cabin, about what it had meant to me and what I had done with it, he didn't say it was brave or inspiring. He just nodded slowly and said, "That makes sense. You don't look like someone who tolerates being unseen anymore." We began seeing each other regularly. Nothing rushed or dramatic, just simple, intentional connection. He wasn't trying to fix me. I wasn't trying to prove anything. And that alone felt like a revolution. For the first time, I let someone in not because I was lonely, but because I was full, and I had room to share that fullness. One Saturday, a few months later, Aaron and I drove back to the cabin. It was his first time seeing it in person. The trees were dusted in snow, and the trail leading up to the porch crunched under our boots. I watched his expression as we approached the front door. He didn't say much, just looked around like he understood the gravity of the place. Inside, everything was quiet. The fireplace had been set earlier that morning by one of the staff. The lights were low, casting soft shadows on the floor. I showed him the room where I used to sleep as a child, now converted into a reading lounge for the women who stayed. I showed him the kitchen, where I had once stood alone, an empty plate in my hands, wondering what I had done wrong. And then I showed him the porch, the spot where I had made peace with all the versions of myself I had ever been. Aaron sat down beside me on the wooden swing, took my hand and said, "You turned pain into sanctuary." I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need decoration. Over the following year, the retreat flourished. Word spread quietly through the right circles. Social workers, counselors, shelters. Women who needed rest came. Women who needed silence. Women who needed to be reminded that they could begin again. The cabin filled with voices, with art, with music. It became what I never had, a safe place to fall apart and start over. There were moments, of course, when my past tried to pull me back in. One spring, my cousin Laura reached out again. She said she'd been in therapy, that she had started unpacking her own upbringing, and that she finally understood why I had drawn the lines I did. She didn't ask to reconnect. She just wanted to say she was sorry. I thanked her. I believed her. And that was enough. There was no reunion, no dramatic apology scene, just truth, acknowledged and released. Nathan, on the other hand, remained distant. I saw photos of his kids online from time to time, growing taller, wearing Halloween costumes, playing soccer. He never blocked me, but he never reached out either. That used to sting. Now, it just was. Not everything broken needs to be mended. Some fractures stay as they are, not out of bitterness, but because not every story needs a ribbon-tied ending. My mother never visited the cabin, but one day I received a book in the mail, a collection of poems. Inside, she had bookmarked one and underlined a verse. "The daughter who grows wild is the one who survives the frost." There was no signature, just that. I kept the book. Years passed, seasons turned, and every November, when Thanksgiving approached, I lit a candle at the cabin, not to remember who wasn't there, but to honor who had finally arrived. Me. Not the version that sought approval or begged for belonging, but the woman who had taken the long road back to herself, the woman who had once been served last, and now served herself with love, with truth, with fullness. This was the conclusion not of a tragedy, but of a quiet rebellion, not a story about family lost, but a woman found. Years later, I returned to the cabin alone on a foggy autumn morning. The road was wet from overnight rain, and the trees that lined the gravel path were shedding golden leaves with every passing breeze. I drove with the windows slightly cracked, letting the crisp air fill the car, carrying with it the scent of pine, wet earth, and something faintly sweet, maybe the memory of cedarwood from the porch swing. Time had passed, but the land felt untouched by it. The world had spun, and I had changed, but the cabin stood exactly as I had left it. Simple, strong, and steady. It wasn't mine anymore. Not technically. The foundation had taken over full operations, and a new board of directors ran the day-to-day programming. But I had been invited back as a guest speaker for their annual retreat, a weekend reserved for women who had completed their healing programs and now returned to share what they'd rebuilt. I hadn't said yes immediately. Part of me wondered if I had already closed that chapter, but something deeper told me I needed to come back. Not for closure, but for acknowledgement. A full circle moment, not just for me, but for the version of me who once stood here carrying everything on her shoulders and asking for nothing in return. As I stepped out of the car, the fog began to lift in slow swirls. I walked up the wooden steps and paused on the porch. There was a new welcome mat, a different wreath on the door. The swing had been sanded and restained. The cabin had evolved in subtle ways, cared for by new hands, but its essence remained. It was still a place of quiet resilience, still a shelter, still a witness. Inside, I was greeted by a woman named Celia, one of the coordinators. She smiled warmly, the kind of smile that didn't feel forced or professional, but lived in. We'd only exchanged emails before, but her eyes told me she knew exactly who I was, not because of notoriety, but because of shared understanding. "We're glad you came back," she said softly. I nodded. Me too. She showed me to the reading room where I'd be speaking later. The chairs were already arranged in a circle, a pitcher of water and mugs set on the small table in the center. Through the window, I saw several women gathered outside by the fire pit, wrapped in shawls and deep in conversation. One of them was crying, but she wasn't alone. Another woman had her hand on her shoulder. There was no fixing, no rushing, just presence. That was the essence of the place. Not answers, just space. Later that evening, as twilight settled over the trees, I sat in that reading room with 20 other women. Some were young, their pain still raw and recent. Others were older, their losses spanning decades. But every one of them had made the journey here for the same reason: to reclaim the parts of themselves that the world had tried to silence. I spoke slowly. I didn't bring notes. I didn't rehearse. I just told the truth. I used to believe that being the quiet one, the helpful one, the one who never made waves, would earn me love. I thought if I hosted enough holidays, paid for enough dinners, showed up enough times, eventually someone would see me. But what I didn't understand back then was that you can't serve yourself last forever and expect to stay whole. Eventually, you disappear. And one Thanksgiving, I finally realized I was gone. The room was silent, not heavy, but still. Some nodded. Others clutched their mugs. I went on. So I did something that scared me. I told the truth, not with a scream, not with a fight, but with a boundary. I said no, and then I kept saying it, until one day I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt free. When I finished, no one applauded. No one needed to. Instead, the silence filled with something better than applause: recognition. They had heard not just my story, but echoes of their own inside it. After the session, a woman named Tamika approached me. Her eyes were red but steady. "I thought letting go meant failure," she said. "But maybe it just means choosing life." I smiled. Exactly that. We talked for an hour on the porch, wrapped in blankets and sipping tea. She told me about her sister who hadn't spoken to her in years, about the guilt that chased her every time she prioritized her own peace. She said she didn't want to carry the weight anymore. I didn't offer advice. I just listened. Sometimes the listening is the most powerful gift we can give. The next morning, I woke early and walked the trail behind the cabin. The forest was still wet from dew, the ground soft beneath my boots. As I reached the clearing by the old wooden bench, I saw a small plaque attached to the backrest. It hadn't been there before. It read, "To the woman who stayed true to herself and built a place for others to do the same." No name, just truth. I didn't cry. I just sat down, laid my hand over the plaque, and whispered a quiet thank you. The retreat ended that Sunday. I said my goodbyes with quiet hugs and long glances. Before I left, Celia handed me a journal. "We keep one for every speaker," she explained. "A place where the women can write what your story meant to them." I read it later, at home, page after page filled with handwritten words: gratitude, resonance, courage. My story had become part of something bigger than me. A thread in a tapestry woven with hundreds of other voices who had once believed they were alone. Months passed, and life continued in its slow, steady rhythm. Aaron and I moved in together. Nothing flashy or rushed. We found a little house on the edge of town, with a garden and a big window where the light poured in every morning. We kept things simple. We spent Sundays reading, cooked together on weeknights, and talked about someday building a retreat space of our own, not for others, but for us. A place with no ghosts, just beginnings. I still visited the cabin once a year, not out of obligation, but reverence. It had been the setting of my transformation, but it was no longer the center of my life. That belonged to the woman I had become. And sometimes, when I drove past the old neighborhoods where my family still lived, I didn't feel bitterness anymore. I felt distance. Distance that protected me. Distance that reminded me that love does not require martyrdom, that silence is not always strength, and that being served last doesn't mean you are less deserving. It only means you are surrounded by people who didn't know how to serve, but I did. I knew how to serve with love, with care, with honor, and most importantly, I had learned how to serve myself first, not out of selfishness, but out of necessity, because no one can drink from an empty cup, and no soul can thrive in the shadows of neglect. This is what I leave behind. Not a legacy of revenge, not a story of bitter separation, but a blueprint for becoming. A story that began with silence and ended with strength. A quiet revolution told not in shouts, but in choices. And if one woman reads this, years from now, and decides to step out of her own shadows, to reclaim her voice, her space, her worth, then every moment of my journey will have mattered. Because sometimes, the greatest transformation doesn't come from being seen. It comes from seeing yourself clearly for the first time, and serving yourself without apology. Have you ever had to set a boundary with the very people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, just to protect your own peace? If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more real journeys of healing, transformation, and self-worth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away from what hurts, even if it wears the mask of family. And if you've ever felt like you were always served last, remember, you don't have to stay at a table where you're no longer fed. You are allowed to choose yourself, always. Thank you for listening to my story.